Welcome, everyone. I'm Amy Virshup, the editor of the travel and at home sections of the Times, and I have the great pleasure tonight of joining Curtis Sittenfeld in a conversation about short story writing, based on an article she wrote for the at home section about how to finally write that short story you've been putting off for years. Since so many of you have joined us, I think you obviously know who Curtis is, but I will just give you a quick bio. She is the best-selling author of 6 novels, including Prep, American Wife, Eligible, and Rodham, the most recent one, and one short story collection, You Think It, I'll Say It, which was a Reese Witherspoon book club pick. Her books have been selected by the New York Times, Time Entertainment Weekly, and People for their 10 Best Book of the Year lists, optioned for television and film, and translated into 30 languages. Her short stories have appeared in the Washington Post and Best American Short Stories anthology. She is the 2020 guest editor for the Best American Short Stories. Just a quick reminder to everyone watching, we will be taking questions toward the end of our discussion today, so start thinking about your questions now. You can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit your questions throughout our chat. First of all, Curtis, I want to talk a little bit about the article that you wrote for us. And one of the things that I was really struck by in it was the idea that in a lot of writing is really about making the mental and actually physical space for you to write. So can you talk about that?
Yes. So, well, first, thank you for having me, Amy. This is such a pleasure. So I think that like sometimes people can feel like writing fiction is a little bit mystical, or like you need to have a special mood or special powers, but it's really, honestly, it's a lot like completing any other task that you want to complete. And even saying task, maybe it doesn't sort of do justice to like the pleasures it can provide. But I think a lot of it is just like thinking about when will your schedule realistically allow you to do it, deciding in advance, deciding everything you need so you don't get to the moment of like you've cleared your schedule, but you write longhand and like you don't have enough paper, or like you planned to write in one room and there are like 3 children in that room or something, just hypothetically. So I think a lot of it is planning ahead and setting up the circumstances so that when it's time to write, you really can write, even if you have a sort of modest amount of time in your schedule.
And I mean, and then you just sit down and the ideas start flowing. How does one even start?
Well, I think also there's this sort of logistical advance work, which is, deciding when you'll do it, where you'll do it, whether you need any supplies. And then there's the sort of creative advance work, which is deciding what you want to write about, and maybe even thinking about the structure of your story and how you want to write about it, like how you'll start. But the thing that I can't emphasize enough, and this is certainly not original to me, like I think probably almost every professional writer thinks this, you have to sort of give yourself permission to produce bad work that then you improve. And so I think that a lot of times people think that maybe the difference between a professional writer and an amateur writer is that a professional writer is more talented, but I don't think that's true. I think the difference is that when a professional writer produces bad work, she knows that, she's just like, her job is to improve it and not to abandon it. And like, that's maybe the amateur abandons it because it didn't turn out.
Uh-huh. And I was struck also by your saying that you had been told when you were a writing student, like not to go back and kind of reread and polish what you had written previously, but to just keep going until you had gotten to the end before going back and doing that work.
Yeah. I mean, there are a lot of writing adjacent activities that are not writing. And so like one is doing research, which like, research has its pleasures, but it shouldn't be mistaken for writing. One is editing or revising. Again, very similar to writing, but not writing. And then, yeah, like, so I think that there's one successful writer that I know of who will not go on to the next sentence unless the previous sentence is perfect. But I think when people complete, whether it's like a dissertation or a novel, most people I know who have completed a book length work and also a story, just like sort of wrote a pretty messy first draft. Then the draft exists, and then you can evaluate it as a whole, because a lot of times you can get lost within a paragraph trying to make a paragraph perfect. And then 3 weeks later, you realize not only do you cut that paragraph, but like the 5 paragraphs around it. And it's the structure of the whole that matters much more than any individual sentence or paragraph.
Uh-huh. Do you remember the first short story that you wrote?
So I'm one of those people where I loved to read and write from the time I was literally capable. So I think I probably became literate around the time I was 6. And actually, one of my very early memories is of seeing the movie Annie, the Little Orphan Annie movie in the theater, and being so inspired that I basically plagiarized, like as if I had come up with the idea and like wrote like, I am an orphan, I live in a, and so, yeah, I mean, I feel like from a very young age, I spent a lot of time, I think like often like, sitting on my bed, scrawling in a notebook. And I have always felt like, I feel this way actually, not to flatter you, about newspapers, magazines, and books, where I feel like they take everything that's like in life, there's all this like mushy stuff or like boring stuff. But when somebody writes something for you, they're making this distilled, juicy present that's like everything interesting. I mean, there are boring books, but like in an ideal world, it's like the sort of distilled, engrossing, like good stuff about life.
And what's the difference, as somebody who writes both novels and short stories? Is there a difference? Does that first sentence, and we're going to get to some first sentences after this, but like, does the first sentence of a short story bear even more weight than the first sentence of a novel? Or, how does it feel different to write them?
That's an interesting question. I'm not even sure I know the answer. I mean, people like to say that in a short story, every sentence matters more. There's no room for error. So I suppose, yes. But it's funny. So there's a kind of truism among writers that says that like a novel is like a marriage, and a short story is like a date. And so, like almost like it doesn't get soft or boring. But I actually think maybe to me a better analogy is, I almost feel like a good short story is like meeting a friend you really like for coffee or a drink. I mean, I wish we were all doing that. I'm not, but in that better world, it's like meeting a friend for like a drink or coffee. And a novel is like having your friend come and stay with you for the weekend. And I think that there may be moments in the novel, like there's like where it gets a little more slack, or maybe you almost like wonder, am I going to stick with this novel? But then there can also be unexpected moments of like pleasure or intimacy or like intrigue or poignance that wouldn't arise if you hadn't put in the time.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about, let's go over some of the first sentences. So I'm sure many of the people who joined us tonight took a shot at writing their short story, and many of them may have sent us a first sentence. Curtis went through them and selected some of her favorites, and I'll read the first one, and then we'll alternate reading them. And then Curtis, I'd like you to tell me what caught your eye on these, what makes them so compelling. So, my mother-in-law, Ilsa, had never shared much about her childhood, but I do know that for an extended period of time, she had needed to eat only leeks, and as a result, she now can't stand them.
I know. Well, I mean, I feel like, one, it was such a delight. Like, I think there were probably, I don't know, like 150 or 160 sentences. And if some of you are watching, they were anonymous. Like, I don't know the age or name or anything about who submitted them. And and one thing I should say, so the ones we're reading are my favorites, that it's everything about fiction is so subjective. And even like my tips for writing fiction, you know, they sort of, not only do they work for me, but in some ways it's like me talking to myself and saying like, Curtis, do these things and don't do these things, and like plan ahead. And but so I do feel like it'll become clear. I mean, I like family stories. I like first person narrators. I like things that are sort of unfold over decades. But I feel like, so this particular sentence, I mean, the whole like, she had needed to eat only leeks in her childhood. Oh my, I mean, that's like a novel right there. Forget about a short story.
Right.
And then there's also, it's interesting that it's not just like, you know, Ilsa had to do this. It's like my mother-in-law, like there's also a whole other relationship for us to, so it's almost just like setting up these circumstances that make the reader curious and make the reader want to keep reading. And also just having this sort of confident tone, like saying, I'm gonna tell you something, and I know that you're gonna be interested, like you're gonna be on the edge of your seat. Okay, should I read the next one?
Yes, why don't you read the next one?
Okay. She had taken me to court, so there was a distinct lack of cordiality when we ran into each other on the elevator. Well, so that one, I mean, there's so many things that are not good in life, like conflict, are great in fiction, like conflict, problems, you know, people that you sort of like can't stop thinking about in good or bad ways because they drive you crazy, or like because you're in love with them, and all that stuff. So there's all this like emotion. She had taken me to court. It's like, is this your neighbor? Is this your ex-wife? Is it, they're just a lot of juicy possibilities. And they're in this physically enclosed space of an elevator. So again, right there, it's like tension and sort of trappedness, and tension is great for fiction.
And there's such a, you know, this is such understatement, like, you know,
Yeah.
this is a person taking you to court. The lack of the distinct lack of cordiality just has this kind of delightful, I agree with you. Okay, here we've got another one. This one is a little not restrained. Irvin, your house is going up in flames, yelled JC over the thundering of the looms in the weave room.
Okay, I think that like there's like three weird things, maybe only two, but I think three weird things going up in it. Like the your house is going is like, you know, with it's like apostrophe with the G left off. So, which I feel like almost has like a sense of humor, but it's the looms in the weave room that really push things over the edge for me, where I just thought like, I don't know what's going on. Like, it seems like a lot of things, and I would like to know more. Okay, should I read the next one?
Yeah.
Okay. I was a barista by night, and in the mornings I worked as personal assistant to Steve Kupiecki, an Orthodox Jew who was once an ice skater in his flamboyant period during the 80s before he retired all that and went into business. I just love this. I mean, who among us can resist like an Orthodox Jew who was once an ice skater during the 80s before he retired all that? And again, there's the like it's, to me, I do think it's maybe doubly interesting to set up an interesting character and situation, and then have the implication be that, but the story is told by someone else. So you think like, what is the relationship between the narrator and the person they're describing?
Yeah. Okay. On Sundays, my father took me to funerals. It's like, is he a minister?
Exactly. I know. Or
was it for
like,
fun?
Yeah, a hobbyist. Is he a hobbyist? Okay. This one, actually, I will say, I read some of these out loud to my family, and my husband said that the next one, he said, "Didn't you write that novel?" Which so maybe it's like, you know, Nell's first vision came to her at a sleepover when she was 10, although she chalked it up to too much yoo-hoo and being afraid of the dark. I either wrote or would like to read that novel. No, I just, again, it's like, I think also in a lot of these sentences, there's this tone of sort of humor and knowingness, which is like very appealing. Like, it's almost as like hearing a voice and wanting to keep hearing it, you know, or like feeling like, ooh, like almost like meeting a person and thinking like, oh, like you're interesting. I want to keep talking to you.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm. On the night I was born, my parents had gone dressed as Elizabeth Taylor and Mike Todd to a masquerade ball.
I love that. I mean, yeah, again, it's like it evokes a certain time period. And it's also on the night I was born. So therefore, like, how does the narrator know what information has, like, I think it's almost like giving the reader enough to be intrigued, but then like also raising questions that are very much unanswered is a very appealing combination. Okay. We lived on a road where the women drove faster than the men. I just love that. It's so weird.
Me too.
You get a good one next.
Yeah. So this one, Caitlin, I just French kissed the dog, said Fiona, my 10-year-old soon-to-be stepdaughter, and he loved it.
Who among us would not want to read on? Okay, this is the last one. I knew who Tim Davis was in high school, but I didn't introduce myself to him until after my mom ran him over with her car. I mean, again, many situations. Well, okay, so one thing that I think like I feel like some of the sweetest words in the English language to me are if someone, like if a friend or, you know, one of my sisters or something, or my brother says, like, I have a crazy story for you, or like, you will not believe what just happened to me. And in some ways, I think that you could, I mean, there's so many approaches to take with a story, but you could think that the story, the first sentence of the story could be like the second sentence someone says after, like, I have a crazy story to tell you. So like, you know, and then it's like, I just blah, 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 or like, you know, this thing just happened, or I just heard this thing, or, because, I mean, again, sometimes with like more literary stories, like people almost are reluctant to have a plot, but it's like interesting and satisfying. And I think there's something innate in humans that likes like a story. A story is something happening, something changing, something being different than it was before. And like sort of maybe starting the moment that thing starts to change, or the moment someone realizes it start to change, can be very interesting.
Yeah, in the article that you wrote for us, you make that point that you need to have change in order for there to be a story, and that you have to think through how is this situation going to change? Because I know personally, as a writer attempting fiction, I can write a situation, but I'm not so good at writing, you know, change from one situation to another.
I mean, I think it's like years and years ago, an editor gave me this advice that was basically like, almost like, why is this the day that the story starts, or why is this different? And I think it's not like, you know, you don't want to have something that's almost like a day in the life of so and so. Like you want there to be, again, conflict and you know, something is different at the end and the beginning. And actually, another sort of tip is, if you listen to This American Life pieces, those are very story shaped. Like, it's like something happens. It's not, I mean, like a profile. I mean, and certainly there's plenty of newspaper articles too, but like a profile is more like, this person exists and, you know, whatever, like maybe has done this thing. Whereas like, there is something like I do think to, you know, you have to take a moment and sort of think like, what is a story? What makes a story a story? How does something change? what's it like in the beginning and what's it like at the end, and then how do you get there, and getting there is the story.
Right. Okay, so now we're going to take some questions from the audience, and we had a lot of excellent questions come through, and we'll try to work through as many as we can. So Catherine de la Fuente asks, is the notion of ebb and flow, procrastination, and bursts simply part of writing, or is it possible to teach yourself to sit down and write on command?
I think that it's basically possible to teach yourself to sit down and write on command. So, I mean, I think that, again, getting back to this idea that writing is sometimes romanticized, and I think people ask, like, am I in the mood to write? Like, has the muse perched upon my shoulder? And like, that is never the question, because it's like, you never say to yourself, like, am I in the mood to brush my teeth? Like, that's not, which again, it's the weird thing is it makes writing sound like drudgery to say that, but it's almost like there's such deep rewards to writing, but you have to sort of climb inside your own piece of writing and immerse yourself there to access those rewards. They don't really, I think for most people, it's not like you sit down and then you're immediately transported to another world. Like you have to kind of burrow in. I mean, I think a lot of analogies about exercise are similar, where like, again, I think if somebody is, a runner or whatever you're like, yoga or whatever, like the question is not necessarily, do you feel like doing a workout, but it's like, what has it given you by the end? Or is there some moment in the middle that feels sort of transcendent or gives you something that other things don't give you? So I think that so much of writing is about habit, and that being sort of disciplined about habit allows you to get the gifts of it that are much more like rich and sort of ineffable.
So Jennifer Van Stella asks, do you write your stories linearly from beginning to end, or do you jump around, perhaps writing the ending before you write the beginning?
So I think that I try to write them in order, but sometimes I don't know. So it's almost like I think I've started at the beginning, and then I write 10 pages and I realize that what I thought was the beginning is actually the middle, or maybe the end. So I think I'm very flexible, but again, it's, for me, a lot of times it has to sort of, it's almost like the whole big messy structure has to exist, and then I can evaluate it and say like, oh, no, this clearly belongs here. And it's harder to evaluate the whole before the whole exists. The WHOLE.
Right. So this question is sort of along the same lines. Alexander Smith asks, what structural points of your story do you feel are essential to have in place before you sit down to write it? Do you outline first?
So I do outline. I mean, sometimes if let's say I have a voice, or maybe I have a first line or a situation or something that just kind of pops into my head. And I'm not even sure where it came from, but I think, okay, I want to just kind of experiment with that. And I might sit down and write like 1 or 2 pages. And then it's almost more like if you hit a wall or come to a point of confusion, that's where an outline can be very useful. And I don't think like an outline is not like a contract with yourself where you have to obey it. It's more like a map or something. Like, it's like it guides you if you get lost, but if you see a better way, I mean, like, try it, go for it. But yeah, I do. And for stories, I do outlines. And like, certainly for novels, not only do I do outlines, but I end up revising outlines. Like, even like sometimes I'll spend like an hour and a half revising an outline, actually, because like, as I've written, I've realized that everything is so different than I thought it was. I'm totally contradicting my response.
So is that writing, or is that writing adjacent?
That's such a good question. I think the truth is it's writing adjacent, but it's like crucial writing adjacent. Like I sometimes feel like I cannot move forward unless I've done. I mean, it's almost like if your desk gets so messy that you can't even, reach it or something. At that point, like, okay, maybe you have to clean your desk before you put in your writing time. Even
And Bill Banning would like to know, he'd like to know your work habits. So tell us about the time of day that you write, the number of hours. Do you write every day? Do you have rituals? Are you like, a hitter? You spit on both palms and then.
not during a pandemic. No. I mean, one thing I should say is I'm incredibly lucky that I'm a full-time writer. Like, I'm a full-time fiction writer, and that is my job. And one time, I'm trying to think how many years ago, let's say this was like 5 years ago, a woman came up to me at a public event in West Virginia and basically said, like, I know you have 2 children who are relatively young, and like, you've written all these novels, and I want to know how to do it. And actually, anyone who essentially has a few books, I mean, some people are like full-time professors or full-time many other things and have books, but like, I am not a model for a person who has a full-time job and is trying to write a book. Like, it's like, the thing I'm supposed to do is write books. It's my job. And that's, so that all that said, I mean, I try to write, well, the weird thing is that there are times when I feel like I'm bad at everything else and I only know how to write. So I almost like I think on the weekend I'll be like, well, I just did, like, that was a disaster. Like, I guess I'll just write to like make myself feel confident or something. But my norm is like, I try to write for a few hours in the morning every weekday. And then like, and that's another thing, again, almost like the one writer I know of who makes every sentence perfect before he goes on to the next one. There are like 3 very successful writers I know of who supposedly write like 8 or 9 hours a day. One is John Irving and one is Emily Giffin. That's very unusual. You can write an entire book writing like, an hour a day, probably an hour a day every day or 5 days a week for a year. You can write a story in a few months. I mean, again, people have different paces, but almost nobody who's a fiction writer, some people, but very few of them write like 8 hours a day.
So do you write a couple of hours in the morning? Do you have an office that you go to? You close the door? Or are you like, Robert Caro, who puts on his suit and tie in order to go sit at his typewriter? Is there, like the writing outfit?
I put on Robert Caro's suit and tie, and then I know I've always longed for someone to compare me to him. No, so I have like a little office in my house. I do have kids, and obviously the pandemic has sort of changed everything, and I have seen a few articles where people like time the quantity of interruptions, and I'll say, I mean, my kids are old enough that I'll say, like, this is my writing time, and I'd be happy to do such and such, like after lunch. But I mean, one other, like, the sort of flip side of this is I actually think people who have, like, say, an hour and a half, like someone who says, I'm going to set my alarm for 5 a.m. and I'm going to get up Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and I'm going to write for an hour and a half. I think people know how precious that time is, and they know what a choice they've made. And often, I think those people can be very productive and get the same amount of work done as someone who maybe has 6 hours of childcare a day.
Okay, Rahel Solman asks, how do you come up with topics for your novels and stories? Do you draw from your own experience?
So it's interesting because there are lots of books and I think lots of advice there about how to generate ideas. And I almost feel like the fact that generating ideas that's not the challenging part to me. Like, that's what makes me a writer. That it's almost like I mean, I have ideas for more books than I'll ever write. And I think sometimes it's like, my being a neurotic person. And so like this is one example. Years ago, I was supposed to meet a friend of mine for dinner. And she lived in my neighborhood, and I thought like, oh, I'll just go knock on her door and see if she wants to drive over together. And like, I could see the lights on, but she wasn't answering the door. And then I texted her and she wasn't, and I thought to myself, like, she's been kidnapped. Like, I don't, like, and I don't know what to do next. And and of course it was like, she had met her sister for a drink ahead of time. And so I think I almost have an overactive imagination, I mean, possibly anxiety, that I've like channeled in this creative direction. And so to me, but I don't, I would like, if you don't have that like churning inside you, I do not recommend cultivating it.
Have you ever had writer's block? Jackie, I don't have a last name for her, but she asks, how long has your longest writer's block lasted, if you've ever had one?
I mean, so again, if the question is like, have I ever felt not in the mood to write? Have I ever felt like disgusted by my own work? Like, yes. Or I mean, there's certain scenes, probably more in my novels than in short stories, where I've like rewritten the same scene, 7 times, and just thought like, who wrote this? Like, this is horrible. Like, why isn't it turning out? And so I think I've had a lot of frustration, but in terms of feeling like I cannot produce a sentence, I don't think that I've had that. And I think some of that can be like, playing head games with yourself, and almost like in the moment when you're writing, I can't say enough. Just like tell yourself, nobody's going to see this except for me. Like, it's not, and nobody even has to know that I'm doing this, or like, it's totally up to me if I show this to someone else or don't show it. Like, and so like, the fact that your short story might not end up in the New Yorker, like, let that be liberating to you and not discouraging. And just like take all the chances and try all the things, and like, let your sentences be bad until you can improve them, and then like later say to yourself, like it's almost like if you were in a dressing room, like again, in olden times, if you were in a pre-pandemic, like letting yourself try on some article of clothing, like just like do it. You don't have to buy it. You don't have to leave the dressing room. Like, just try.
Put on that feather boa and,
Yes, yeah. Put on that like very like that jumpsuit, that loud, splashy printed shirt.
Now, I'm going to ask it. Do you experience like the feeling of flow when you're writing really well? Does it, that just kind of like channeling through you? That, great athletes speak about having that kind of feeling.
I am a great athlete. No, like I'm part Robert Caro.
You've been Robert Caro, and now you're a great athlete.
So I would say yes, sometimes, definitely not every day. And the best way to interrupt it is by like taking a peek at Twitter, or like, so yeah, I mean, sometimes, and that's the I mean, I do feel like one of my sisters one time, I think, basically said to me, like, it sounds like an insult, but I took it as a compliment. She basically said, I think you're smarter as a writer than as a person. Like, your writer self is smarter than you are. And I think that's like an amazing thing. Like, I especially during pandemic, and part of the reason I really wanted to like have this conversation or encourage people to write their own stories is that I think that like in a best case scenario, if you want to write fiction and you write it, you can like, it's almost like you can create this world inside yourself, or like access certain forms of intelligence that you didn't know you had, or almost like be a person that you didn't know you were. Like, there's a line from Ann Patchett, the writer Ann Patchett, where she talks about that writing can be like the friend you have tea with in the afternoon. And it's almost like writing fiction can be a form of keeping yourself company. And like in the moment you're keeping yourself company. And then it's like this, ultimately this communal act if you share it with other people, which again, you don't have to, but you can.
So Rosa, again, I don't have a last name, asks, if I don't want to be too influenced by other writers, should I stop reading stories for a while, or would it be worse to block the education that comes from reading a lot?
it would be worse to block the education that comes from reading aloud. I mean, I think that, you know, if you feel like there's some writer whose voice just like gets into your bloodstream excessively, like maybe put that writer aside. Or I mean, even I think some fiction writers say, I'm just going to read nonfiction now, but I can't imagine being a writer and caring about writing and not reading at all. Because it's just, I mean, it's just like, you need to kind of see how other people are like using sentences, or you need to know a word that you never knew before. And I think actually a lot of times it's a really thrilling feeling when someone else's writing is kind of inspiring, or and I also think that a lot of times you can feel like you're influenced by a writer, and it's not as conspicuous to a reader as it is to you, as to someone else, you know, reading your work. So I think just like, again, it's like, let your story come out of you. And then, you know, if it like, you know, gives off this like overtones of Karen Russell or whatever, just like, then cut those sentences, like pull that back, but it's fine. Or read Karen Russell.
Kayla Kagan asks, on longer projects like a novel, how many drafts do you generally do?
It's so funny. I feel like this is like a sort of almost existential question where I do not know what counts as a draft. Like if I go through, if I read my 400-page novel and I change like 7 sentences, is that a draft? I don't know. So, I mean, this is ridiculous. I would say 4 on average, but you know, like my first drafts are like incredibly messy, where I would never ask another human to read them, because it's almost like notes to myself. Like it's almost halfway between an outline and an actual story. It's so messy. And there's lots of like brackets of like, this is what I'm going to do here. Like this is, you know, the song that the character is going to be listening to, but I need to like look at what was a really popular song in 1978, and I'm not going to distract myself while I'm writing. So I'll come back to that. So there's a big sort of switch, or like improvement, I hope, from the first draft to the second draft. And then I try to like take it a few more rounds. And also, this is very widespread advice, but read your fiction out loud to yourself, or to your dog. But I read my entire books out loud to myself, even the sex scenes. And then I think, oh no.
I wrote that?
I know. Who did? Who put that there?
Jennifer asks, who is the first person you show your draft to? So you've gone through, you've cleaned it all up, and you finally have what you think is a pretty good draft. Who do you show it to?
That's a great question. So, and that's actually a big reason, if you know, have the money to ever take an online writing class of like a few days or something, or like an in-person, like finding other writers is very valuable and precious. So I have a few writer friends. One of them is my friend Susanna, that I went to grad school with, you know, 20 years ago. One is my friend Emily. Both of them are writers. Susanna Daniel, excellent writer, novelist. Emily Jean Miller, also an excellent novelist. And so they're often like my go-tos. And then it sort of depends. Sometimes, depending on the subject, like I just wrote a story where the main character is a male English teacher. And so I showed it to 2 male English teachers. Or like I wrote a book where the main character is born in Wisconsin in the 1940s. And so when I was in the later drafts, several women who had been born in the 1940s and lived for a long time in Wisconsin read, because like sometimes there's like, you don't know what you don't know. So there's different, like sometimes I'm reading to get kind of like general writerly feedback. And sometimes I'm almost have like fact checking questions. And then also I have 2 sisters and a brother, and they read it like, you know, they're all very intelligent. They don't read that many books a year, any of them. And so sometimes like they will tell me very bluntly, like if it's boring, or they're like a sort of good measure of almost like, you know, there are many people out there who are busy and intelligent and read, say, 1 book a year on vacation, or 4 books a year. And of course I want it to be my book. So it's almost like, I feel like my sisters will say to me like, well, that section, the 50 pages there seemed a little excessive, but I liked that. So they're more like normal people.
Uh-huh.
And not, I mean, writers can often have different tastes from normal people.
So Daniel asks, your article puts a lot of emphasis on continuity of writing, not stopping to do edits or look things up. How does that system work with fantasy sci-fi, where there is a lot of world building involved? Do you do the world building in advance, or do you write whatever comes into your head and then make a coherent world out of it in the editing stage later?
That's a very interesting question. So I don't think that I really do that in my writing. I mean, I think I try to do world building. So one thing I do is every day when I write, I print out what I wrote that day and only that day. So I kind of like, it's like if I am writing a story and I wrote from pages 12 to 14, I print out 12 to 14. So I do think if I think like, wait, what year was like the grandfather born, and that's on page 2, I can look back at that. I mean, my instincts tell me that you treat the world building as like an outline. You do some of it ahead of time. When you are just kind of writing scenes, you just sort of stay in the scene and let there be some missing material. And then you kind of, on the other side, you like dramatically clean it up. But I will say, I feel that I don't, I mean, there's such blurring of genres, but I feel like I do not have much expertise in like sci-fi.
Okay, so this is going to be our last question. And Eileen asks, how do you create unique voices for characters? Do you talk aloud to yourself?
Well, okay, so the piece of advice that I think is so great about only look at like the last sentence you wrote in your last writing session and then keep going in this writing session, that comes from Chris Offutt, who is a fiction and nonfiction writer who was my professor in graduate school. And he gave another piece of advice that I think is it's been incredibly helpful to me over the years. So sometimes if I'm creating like if let's say I'm writing a short story about, and it's like 2 women in their 40s who are friends with each other. Like he basically said, think about who your character most physically resembles, whether it's like a relative, a celebrity, like, someone you went to grade school with, like just some real person, and think of who their personality is most like. Again, whether it's like, a teacher that you had 40 years ago, or, whoever it is. And there's something about like grounding it in reality. So you can almost think to yourself, like, okay, this is somehow like this person physically looks like my second cousin. Like, would my second cousin make this gesture? So it's, instead of almost imagining it from the outside, you're imagining it from the inside. And also I do think that there's an element that can be helpful of like, like almost like you are all your characters. Like people often think that the protagonist is a stand-in for the writer, but like the writer has to inhabit all the characters. So even like I do think sometimes when I'm doing things like it's almost like if I was like, she was eating yogurt, like I would think to myself, like I might be like at my desk being like this or like, like something I'm trying to, there was something where I wanted a character to fill out a questionnaire. And I wanted to be able to say like, he filled it out quickly, but I was like, does that mean like 10 seconds or 30 seconds? So I filled out the questionnaire and like timed it on my watch. It's just like I think of your characters almost as real people, like shamelessly, but respectfully and diplomatically borrow from real people, not in an exploitive way, but in like a, organic, realistic way.
Okay, great. Thank you. So that was our last question. Thank you so much, Curtis. This has been tremendous fun and really, I think, helpful for all of our would-be writers out there, as was your article for At Home. And thank you so much for joining us. It was terrific.
Thank you. Good luck to all of you. I hope, I hope that your writing brings you delight.
I want to know what happens to Irvin and Ilsa when when you finish your story, send them to us.
I know, seriously, you can start having like a weekly short story and at home.
There
We've
we go.
decided. Okay, thank you.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Good night.